Stephen Boyle. And on the opposition, we have the team of Brent Kettles and Josh Sealy. For your judges, this round will be chaired by our CA, Natalya. With panelists, Ryann Atkins, Jason Rogers, Guillaume Laroche, and Vinay.
It's like Cher.
My name is Cassie. I'm going to be your timekeeper for today. Without any further ado, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate and give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Maybe I'll try it. No, it's correct. All right. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, remaining members of the audience. We would like to introduce the gold standard of cases today. Of philosophical cases, rather, because I think when you stay at a tournament as awesome as Winter Carnival, and thanks very much, you want to see something not about, like, insurance or something. Am I right? Am I right? Let's do that. Let's do that. All right. Madam Speaker, you go to bed one night and then wake up in a completely white room. There are no doors. There are no windows. There's no way to get out of this room. The only thing in the room besides you is a white podium with a red button on top. Madam Speaker, we say, push the red button. We have 19 constructive arguments. Broadly speaking, in my speech today, Madam, I'm going to talk about 2 constructive arguments under a theme of the fundamental point of being human. If you guys have any clarifications, I'll take them now. Ain't got none. All right. Which is an excellent example of why, Madam Speaker, we're going to say that inaction is fundamentally inhuman. We're going to say that the way you actually express yourselves as a human, as opposed to any other entity that might have sentience or the ability to interact with the world, is that you act in 2 different ways. We think that humans fundamentally, Madam Speaker, explore. And secondly, we think that humans fundamentally are scientists. They're experientialists. We're going to tell you why necessarily, in order to, and I hate to use this word, Madam Speaker, actualize, so let's forget I said it. In order to express yourself as a human being, to realize your full potential as a human being, you need to act in those ways. I'm also going to tell you why to be human means to fundamentally mean that you need to interact socially. And in order for you to fulfill your dreams and your potential, you need to have either the certainty that you're never going to see the social world again, or the possibility that you may destroy it. Now, I will clarify that pushing this button, you don't know what it's going to do. It could set off a nuclear weapon, it could bring bunnies into the room, it could set you free, but it's going to be anything, okay? Infinite possibilities. That's just a cool word. Okay, so let's talk about the fundamental point of being human. First of all, we're going to talk about the idea of exploration and the idea of human potential. So we would say, Madam Speaker, what essentially separates us from, like, a gorilla or an orangutan, besides a funny Latin name, is the idea that gorillas and orangutans stay put. They don't explore, and they don't necessarily want to push their actions into kind of the majesty of infinity. So we would say, Madam Speakers, even if you don't see the consequences of your action, taking an action is necessarily more human than having any sort of inaction in this situation. We would also say, Madam Speaker, that we reject Descartes' claim that thinking proves existence. We think that providing a proof of your existence, number one, is necessarily going to be better proven by making a mechanical proof of your existence. So interacting with a solid object rather than ephemeral thoughts. I think we can reference quantum mechanics to back me up. And if you guys disagree, I'm going to talk about quantum mechanics again. And I don't think you want me to do that. So we think you get a greater fulfillment of your potential, Madam Speaker. Now, why is fulfilling your potential so important to be human? Because we can see any other animal, any other entity, often just goes along enough to survive. So dogs will love you even if you hit them, but it doesn't fulfill their potential, right? They can maybe be super dogs. They can jump really high. But humans necessarily have a need and a desire and an ability to reach farther, go faster. That's why we pioneers. That's why we have astronauts. That's why we glorify these kind of explorations into the unknown. We think that to be human means to explore the unknown, push that button, go ahead.
But another difference between us and animals is having foresight and the ability to possibly avoid negative consequences. Am I right?
Yeah, but we also have the ability to determine intent at the time of the action, right? So that's why we have things like intent taken into account when people commit crimes, right? So if there's no guilty mind, there can't be any sort of guilty action. I think Stephen's going to talk about when he talks about double effects later on in the speech. So yeah, we have the ability to recognize the consequences of our actions, but when we can't predict them, when we think that it's equally likely that there's a good or a bad action, you should act. You have a moral responsibility to yourself and frankly to humanity to act, Madam Speaker. So let's talk about the idea, oh my goodness. To be human is to be an experientialist, essentially a scientist. Because recognize that one of the other ways that we are different from Pongo or orang is that we have the ability not just to see cause and effect, but to extrapolate from that, right? To make limitless observations and to make limitless extrapolations from the things that we see. We would say, Madam Speaker, that humans are necessarily scientific. That we necessarily strive to learn more about our environment, regardless of what our environment is. I think we can see all along in human destiny, we've been comparing cause and effect, and we've been extrapolating from that, and that's what makes us different from animals. So why should we act in this situation? Because if there's no other stimuli in this situation, there's no other ability to kind of interact with your environment and to see what cause and effect is, and to gain any more knowledge. At the point where you as a human are effectively prohibited from gaining any more knowledge, we would say that you, in a sense, stop being human. You've become dead. I think we can see this in effect with people who've been in solitary confinement, right? One of the reasons why we say solitary confinement is so harmful is because it dehumanizes the individual, because they can no longer interact meaningfully in many sorts of ways in a cause and effect situation. We think you should necessarily gain more knowledge in the situation. Lastly, I want to talk about humanity as a necessarily social being. You're all alone. You have no idea whether what happens when you push the button will be to let you out, to spring you free, to bring people in, maybe to set off a nuclear weapon, to destroy everything. But, Madam Speaker, without the certainty of knowing that you push the button and try, you'd never be able either to grieve for your social self and to mourn your social self like any other psychological being in the situation where you don't get out and you never see humanity again. Or you forever have to live with the possibility of, what if I could have seen my friends and family again? What if I could have had some form of interaction again? We think those kind of what ifs forever torment or are a form of psychological torture on most humans because we have the capacity to be so social. So what have we told you today? We told you, in a sense, that inaction in this situation is necessarily going to demean your humanity, make you less human. We say, glorify humanity. Give yourself certainty. Don't torture yourself psychologically. For all these reasons, we propose also the gold standard.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for her speech and call upon the member of the opposition to open the case for side opposition. You're here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd first like to issue my greatest regard for Monica, knowing my weaknesses and not running a case that has any reference to a specific country or specific government leader, because that would not be good for me to respond to. I'm going to respond to this question with two constructive arguments, and then I'm going to do some refutation. Our main thesis is that you should wait a bit. Recognizing the situation that is presented, that you just woke up in a white room and there is a button and that you should press the button. We don't think that the best decision or even the best representation of purposeful human action is to act instinctively to immediately press the button without any consideration of the potential consequences, or maybe realizing that like a door will open in an hour. So that's kind of the main thing that we want to prevent. First, I'm going to talk about waiting, why you should wait. Secondly, I want to talk about how, if anything, given the lack of information you have, and given certain inferences you can draw, that pressing the button will more likely be harmful than beneficial. We think that it's also reasonable for humans to instinctively want to, protect themselves and self-preserve. We think that's reasonable. So why should you wait? First of all, in terms of the absence of information that you've been presented, we think that when you look at something like the precautionary principle, it's beneficial when you are completely unaware of potential consequences to take a course of action which is more cautious so as to not intervene with what's going to happen and so as to not cause or create further harm. We think that when presented with this situation, we think it fits perfectly. You do not know where you are, why you are there, what the button will do, who put you there. There's very little actual information that you've been presented with which to inform the decision. We think that when not being able to make informed decisions and not being able to have any understanding of the consequences that will come as a result of your decision, we don't think that it is wise to make decisions that may very likely cut off different potential outcomes that could occur. We think that it is far more wise to wait and see if further information can be gained so as to make a more well-advised decision. I don't think that it's a strong stance to say that there's any reason to be immediate, right? Like if we, for instance, if we desire to be social, I don't think that we have a desire to necessarily immediately be social. I don't think that there's any immediacy really drawn. And so I don't know why it's the case that they would propose to you today that it's most beneficial to press this button so early when we think that you could have a much more well-advised decision later on down the road. In particular, and like there's so many obvious examples of this, right? Like if you're testing drugs to see whether or not the drugs will help people who are going through a particular illness, we think it's best to have the drugs thoroughly tested before you use them, so that when you do in fact use them, you're best advised as to whether or not they'll have a positive benefit. We don't think the fact that they might work, or maybe they'll work, or maybe they'll save your life, is good enough reason to simply take a drug without any actual advice or any actual knowledge of the consequences. I also want to recognize one other thing, right? They premised a lot of their argument on this idea that to be human is to take action. And I don't think that they have all justified the fact that action, by definition, requires doing something, right? I think if anything, through inaction, you can reflect a purposeful decision to do something, right? And we think inaction is a form of action. I think that's a really reasonable thing. So if it is the case that to be human is to do things, to choose to not do something is absolutely human, right? It's not human if you don't do anything without making the choice, right? Like if you're just standing there like if you are not conscious, or if you're not sentient, or if you're not choosing to do nothing, right? But we think that to the extent that you can consciously decide to take an action as what you think to be the best decision to make, we think that that's every bit as purposeful and meaningful in terms of identifying yourself as a human. And I don't think you always have to do things in order to define your human. Additionally, what we would say is that within this situation, as I said, in terms of the costs and benefits, I think it's quite clear that to take a plan of inaction is actually a more nuanced and sophisticated decision, right? Like I would say, if anything, the idea that we should just press the button, which is like, satisfy our curiosity, I don't think that's like the deepest human emotion, right? Like I think if anything, if you're sitting there thinking, contemplating to yourself what the button might do, thinking about waiting and opening yourself up to different alternatives that might present themselves. I'd say it's not that sophisticated, but it certainly takes a little more thought than just turning and pressing it like an alarm clock that you're turning off or something. So I don't think that there's any level of sophistication or developed humanity that's presented through the model that they're presenting.
Yes. Presuming that nobody came, do you think you should press the button eventually?
Okay, so this approach is like a very annoying philosophical question. I would say that if you waited a really, really long time, I think that you probably shouldn't press the button, is what I'm going to say. I recognize there's other harms that can come as a result of that, but I still think that given that you're unaware of the potential outcomes, I'd say that that's still a more purposeful decision to be made. So, I'm not going to tell you that it's completely desirable. There's a bunch of great obvious benefits from doing that, which is why it's kind of weird to argue for it, but I do think that it's still a better option to be taken. The second thing that I want to talk about is why the button's likely harmful, right? So recognize that if humanity is this really social thing, some individual or group or something puts you into this room as a form of antisocial act, right? They're constraining you and removing you from the rest of society. To the extent that this is probably something you wouldn't want to do, we think that the individual who did it likely has negative motives, and also would likely think that most people instinctively would just decide to press the button through the immediate judgment or conclusion that there are no other options available. To the extent that it seems more likely that an evil as opposed to good person would hide you in a room, I think it is actually likely that the button would just be wrong. What do I want to respond to for that? Okay, first of all, she tells us that being human means acting, meaning doing positive things that cause consequences. I think I showed you how an action is a form of action, which repeats. She said that humans explore, and I think if anything, there's greater exploration in the process of waiting to see what else there is. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that doing this one thing, which may cut off all possible other opportunities that may present themselves, is the best form or most diverse form of exploration. So I don't think that that's the case. In terms of social interaction, I don't think that greater social interaction is a necessary consequence of pressing the button, right? So I think if waiting allows you to get more information and maybe make a better decision, that's more likely to enable you to escape or something. I think that's a great avenue through accessing social interaction. Additionally, as I already said, the person's likely nefarious, right? So if you decide to press the button and it does just kill you or something, that doesn't enhance social interaction in any way. So I don't think as a necessary consequence of their plan that you have maximum socializing through the pressing of the button. So I don't think that's the case. They said that animals don't explore. And again, I think that the more key difference is that I think humans are a lot more reflective and introspective. Right? I think if an animal saw something like there's a steak, you'd eat it, the animal will just go up and eat it. I think a human might think more, like maybe it's poison, right? Like I think introspection and thinking about potential consequences is far more human an attribute than just doing things instinctively. Finally, they said you can't gain knowledge. And again, I think by waiting, you actually do gain the most important or only knowledge you can gain given your circumstances. For all these reasons, we stand proudly in opposition.
I'd like to thank the member of the opposition for his speech and call upon the Minister of the Crown to further the case of her side government. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to have 4 points of refutation, and then I'm going to bring 4 new points. First is the implication of a creator from the presence of the book. The second is double effect. The third is what personality and personhood mean, deepening what we heard from Monica. And lastly, I want to talk about how being human is to question and to interact, and how all knowledge, all intellect is derived from sensory experience, and how those primary experiences should be the motivator of you as a human being. First off, he says, we should wait a bit. We didn't say you should run up, go bam, straight away. We think maybe 34 minutes would be the perfect amount of time. Weigh the information, having assessed the arguments that Monica and I present to you, and when it gets a good devil's advocate case that you create for yourself, you should then choose to press the button. The second argument they give to you, and this is a serious one, I'm going to talk about it more later, is, okay, having decided that you're going to wait a bit, does it mean that you should now choose to press the button? And he says, well, you probably shouldn't, which means a lot of his argumentation about waiting and seeing how things play out becomes irrelevant. And the precautionary principle means you're not taking precaution, which is to do things cautiously, but precluding action entirely, which is distinct from the actual precautionary principle that he introduced. Next was, what if an evil person is the one that's put you there? That is a potential outcome. It is possible. But it is also possible that you have a V for Vendetta style scenario, where somebody, in order to force you to understand what it is to be human, to make you actualize your experiences, to give you the opportunity to understand and explore in your own cavity of mind how fragile your personality is, has given you the chance to actualize yourself. And by shying away from that actualization, you deny yourself your full potential as a human being. The third thing that they said was, well, what about the human reflective and introspective personality? Is that not also a facet of being human? It certainly is. We didn't say that you should do this without intellectual consideration for the outcomes. In fact, that's why we're giving you arguments about why you ought to do this. So we think that reflective process should ultimately lead you to the conclusion that your interaction with the environment, your manifestation of your humanity in its most actualized terms, is what the outcome of this deliberative process should be. So we agree with them that you should deliberate, that you should ponder, that you should question. But the question is, having reached that process, having gone through that process, what action ought you to take? We say that you should push the button. Let's move on. The creator. So there is clearly the implication of the presence of a creator. You know from your past experience of the world that when you see things put in front of you that have manifest design, that it is extraordinarily likely that somebody has created those and that it is a product of another individual. What does that mean? It means, moving on to the other idea of double effect firstly, that you're not morally culpable for the outcomes of pressing the button should they be negative. We draw an analogy here to other ways in which we implement the doctrine of double effect. So take, for example, a doctor that chooses to prescribe a large amount of morphine, enough to cure the pain of a late-stage cancer patient. Sometimes that dosage of morphine may kill the patient, but we'd say that the doctor is not morally responsible for the death of that patient because their intention was to help the patient and relieve them of their pain. The same way that a soldier might know that a human shield could be killed in the defense of their own life, but they are not morally culpable for the death of that other individual. The soldier who is using the human shield is morally culpable for that outcome. So we'd say if there are negative moral outcomes that come as a consequence of this, the presence or implication of a creator, which they have also accepted, means that you as an individual choosing to press the button are not morally responsible for those negative outcomes, given that your intention is to press the button in order to further your experience of what it is to be human, to deepen that experience. Yes?
Okay, so that lack of intent shows why you shouldn't be morally culpable for it. It's still a negative outcome. Like why would you still want to encourage the possibility of a negative outcome?
Obviously there is a possibility of a negative outcome. I'm just saying you should weigh that against the potential benefits. Moving on to the third idea. Personality and personhood. Your personality is actually a far more fractious and discontinuous process than many of us like to tell ourselves. We are not the ghost in the machine. We are in fact the machine itself. And what neuroscience would tell us is that all of our knowledge is derived primarily from our interaction with our senses. We therefore tell ourselves stories about the information that we have, about the processes that we go through, many of which are subconscious, and then construct personality based upon that. As Virginia Woolf said, there is no Beethoven, there is no Shakespeare, there is most assuredly no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. What does she mean by that quote? She meant when you look at literature, when you look at art, when you look at exploration, we internalize those and make them part of our own understanding of what it is to be a human being. So the other person's creation is distinct for each one of us. Be that whether you love or hate Lady Gaga or whether you love or hate Shakespeare, your interaction with other products of human ingenuity, other products of human development, make you a more fully realized human being because you internalize their ideas and make them anew for yourself by filtering them through the process of your personality. By pressing the button, you give yourself another experience that allows you to understand more what it is to be a human being, to understand your own experience of your humanity. In the absence of any knowledge of whether there is a God, in the absence of any knowledge of a purpose that we have in the world, we would argue that what you ought to do as a human being, what you ought to do as an individual, is to seek out as many of those experiences as you possibly can. Because by taking those experiences onto yourself, you augment your own personality, you augment your personhood, and you make them part of who you are. You, in a very real sense, by adding experiences through your senses, become a greater person, a person with more experience, a person who is more actualized with your potential. We would say that is what it should mean to be human. So what does being human mean? It means to question and to interact with your environment. That's what we get out of Monica's case. That's what we want to propose here today. And we can see that in science and literature, in exploration. All of these are avenues through which we try to understand these crazy circumstances in which our consciousness woke us up to a world that we were incapable of understanding. But in striving to understand, we have pushed back the boundaries of the darkness. We have pushed back the reasons that we need God. And we've understood more of what it is to be human. That is what's led us to understand the laws of science. That is what's led us to understand the order of nature and creation, so we can build things for ourselves that make ourselves happy. Although this may be an evil intent, you deny yourself your humanity by denying yourself the opportunity to press the button. In a much misunderstood quote, Hamlet says in Shakespeare, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles." He didn't mean whether it was better to die or not. He meant that by not taking arms against the troubles that are put in front of you, you deny yourself your actualization as a human being. We would say that you should reach the same conclusion that he did, that you should push back the front of what it is to be human. You should interpret those experiences and therefore become a more real human being and fulfill your potential. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to propose. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Minister of the Crown for his speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to give a 10-minute address. You're here.
It was a shot. Okay, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. This has nothing to do with the debate, but I'll point it out anyway. I'd like to let everybody know that the very first time I was actually ever in a final round, it was debating with Monica at UBC. And we only ever got there because Monica made a joke in the round preceding it about fisting. And now in what is likely my very last final in QSID, I am against Monica with the former dean of debate at UBC, and this time I'm the one probably getting fisted. But in any case, life is funny like that. I have one constructive point, Madam Speaker, and then some refutation if I can make any sense of what Boyle actually said. So, yes. And if you get there before I do, then we should still win. So, Madam Speaker, I want to talk first about identifying the variables, because we've heard a lot about kind of the sensory deprivation nature of this room. And I'm not a neuropsychology major, but I think that Monica and Stephen have a basic problem of methodology, which they have failed to define all of the variables. And we think that in the absence of defining and understanding all of the variables, without fully exploring your environment, then you are fundamentally incapable of morally choosing to push the button. It is irresponsible to push the button in the absence of all of the information. And even if you had enough information and they assert that it is still insufficient to understand or even make a prediction about what is likely to happen, then we still think the more morally responsible thing is to not push the button and go die quietly in the corner. So, yeah, that's fine. It's like a weird case. So I've already alluded that Josh and I think that they've missed some key variables. And the one that Josh identified in his speech is a variable of time, right? Because what we're telling you is that waiting is also an affirmative action. By waiting, we also gather additional information. We understand more about the motives and the consequences that whoever our host is in this bizarre scenario has for us. And we would tell you that the longer we wait, actually in some senses, the more we know. Now it is very right, as they posit, that there will come a point at which we can wait no more and we will have to push the button or go crazy or die. And what we would tell you is that on our side of the house, you will, if you don't have enough information, then you shouldn't push that button. But I'd like to talk about some of the other things that we could think about, right? Because we really meaningfully understand that there is no way out. And will there become a way out if we wait long enough? Stephen tells you we should wait 34 minutes and that's about it. But it'd be a real bummer if the door opened at the 35th minute. I just think it is. Yeah. No, I know there's no door in the model, but the question about making moral decisions is about the information we have. You may not know that there's a door, or there may be a door, but you can't see it. We're saying there's lots of kinds of things you may not actually know. You may not know whether or not the person who is outside this mystical sphere can hear you. If perhaps you're part of a large version of puppet, right? We think that there's lots of information you don't know, and you should definitely not push the button until then. Are you even awake? Or are you like Scott Killian Clark in some booze-fueled coma? The button, but we still say don't do it. So I want to talk a little bit about the precautionary principle, because I've already alluded to, they're just fundamentally, if as they assert all you know now is all you will ever know about this environment, then we still say you shouldn't push the button, because we think that based on what you already know, you have lots of reasons to be really, really worried that there is a high likelihood of material harm to yourself or other people. And we think that as long as what you know leads you to that conclusion, the only moral choice as an explorer, as a scientist, as a creator, as a fister, is to decide whether to push the button or not.
You've admitted in your speech that at some point you will have to push the button. When do the negative effects to yourself start to outweigh the possible negative effects outside of the room? Okay, so no, you don't have to push the button. What we're saying is that I was actually serious when we think it is better to die than to push the button. That's what we're saying. Is that you should, that's what Josh said, right? He said, you should not push the button. That's our case stance, and it's been clear the whole time. But what we would tell you, it has, I'm not just saying that. So, what we would tell you, right, is that, and so now I want to talk a little bit about another important scientific principle, and it's Occam's razor, which I'm sure everybody already knows. That the simplest explanation is likely the most correct one. So, let's think about the motives of our host. This host case sounds like a weekend at Dashes, but Jason is not home. So let's think about a logical exercise, right? No, I know you live with Dashes. What do we know about
are probably a giant Eric Clapton fan with bad taste, but the most important thing is that they are willing to hurt you, or at the very least put you in significant fear, right? This person is willing to kidnap you. This person is willing to go to enormous lengths to confront you with an enormous metaphysical and philosophical dilemma. Like the only result of which, at its very basic level, is that you can have this existential crisis in your life. We think that when you take the only things that you actually know about this person through a process of logic, you have to conclude that more likely than not this person's motives are ulterior, that this person likely means you harm. In which case, it won't matter whether if the person's going to kill you, and we think that there's reason to believe that they might, it doesn't matter either way. But we think where the moral choice to not push the button comes in is the fact that it is entirely possible, and even if it's there's a significant enough possibility, not even probability, Madam Speaker, of killing other people, then we think it's morally wrong to push that button. And we think we know, based on the very few things we know, we think we know enough that you shouldn't push the button. Because we think that a lot of the things they talk about self-actualization, a lot of the things they talk about as exploring, are predicated on the idea of limiting harm, of the harm being to oneself, right? And we think that to the extent that it is a possibility that it will release bunnies into the world, but that I actually carry AIDS and kill everybody, we think you shouldn't do it. So what did Stephen talk about? All right, come on. All right, I didn't understand Stephen's point about the creator. Next. Anyone else? Double effect. All right, so the idea is that if you take an action that is designed to do one thing and it has another outcome, you may or may not be morally culpable for the second double effect. This is horseshit, right? If you understand that there is a high likelihood or even a significant possibility of a really bad outcome, then we think that you are, in fact, aware as a moral agent that you are causing this, right? We think that even if, to the extent that it is possible that you will die, we think that it is not worth it to your self-actualization to risk that to other people. Even if it's only a 2% chance, or a 1% chance, or a 0.01% chance that everyone else in the world will die, given the gravity of the consequence, surely to God, there's a good reason not to push the button. And in the absence of any other information, it's irresponsible. And we think that there's lots of cases where this is true, right? Where, we may decide, right, that, by example, it's, having sex with somebody who is infected with HIV. I think there's a legitimate question, right, about, even if you do use protection, there is still a significant or, a non-statistically insignificant chance of creating significant harm to that person. And I think that it's at least a worthwhile moral question about whether or not you take that risk. And we think that given, the fact that we don't know anything at all, we can't even calculate the probability in this example, the only morally logical thing to do is to apply the precautionary principle. The next thing they talk about is personality, that it is our duty as human beings to experience as much as possible, and that only through experiencing do we form our personality to a sufficient degree that we can be actualized people and understand more about our environments. And so the first thing we would tell you is that the most important thing you can do experientially in this room is wait, right? That the best thing to do is to wait a significant period of time, because we think that over that time you learn more things about yourself and your environment, and perhaps things will be revealed to you in the white room. But the other thing we would tell you, Madam Speaker, is that if your experiential learning becomes harmful to other people, then we really think that that's a justification not to do it, even if it does infringe on your experience. Madam Speaker, I would love to go on an LSD trip. I would love it. But the state tells me, and my mom, that this is a bad idea, right? That this causes harms to other people. Either I may engage in irresponsible actions that put other people at risk, or the act of furthering the drug trade puts other people at risk. So clearly, even though as an explorer in the drug culture is my duty to take the trip, I would tell you that my broader duty as a member of society in which other people live outweighs that duty. And I think that on any kind of utilitarian or proportional analysis, that's going to be in there. The last thing they talk about is only by exploration do we discover the limits of what we know and how do we push it out there. And I think that this is true. There's no question that you will discover what happens when you push the button when you push the button. But that's kind of a ridiculous reason to push the button, right? We think that had the first people who sailed Columbus to America understood that there was even a small chance of bringing back instead of bringing all their plagues to the New World, they would have brought one back that would have killed everybody. We think the Queen of Spain would have been maybe stay home. We think that's a reasonable thing. When we think that the exploration, we predicate the idea of exploration on the risk to the explorers, and it's a self-accepted harm. But when that idea of exploration, like the movie Alien, right? You go out there and you find the thing and you bring it back and it kills everybody, that's a problem. So what have we told you? We told you that you don't have enough information and that we think you have at least an obligation to get as much information you have, and when you do calculate all of the information you have, it overwhelmingly tells you, as a moral and scientific person, don't push the button. For those reasons, I'm
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech and re-invite the Prime Minister to close off the act with their 3-minute rebuttal. Here, here.
After all.
Sam, you gave away the punchline, jerk.
After all, ladies and gentlemen, at Brent's request and after significant reflection, if you're going to be fisting, safety first. What have we heard today? Besides fisting? No. I'll talk about a few things, Mr. Speaker. She's actually a chick. Now I can't go with the women's term. What does it mean to you? Because we haven't really heard a lot of disagreement with what Stephen and I have been saying needs to be human. We've heard a lot of, wait, don't, inaction is good too. I mean, eventually, maybe, but don't. We would say 34 minutes is a very long time reconsidering something that, Speaker. We'd say the following things can happen in 34 minutes. 1.5 million HIV-infected bunnies could die. This is going to end up on the internet and I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. But safe. You could die. I pointed out in a point of information that Brent verbatim said, well, eventually you may have to push the button. And then he said, but no, we would rather you died. There are lots of provisions in society where we think it's okay for you to take extraordinary steps in order to preserve your own life, even if it costs other individuals theirs. So I would say defending yourself against possible intruders, maybe defending yourself like they want to do against starvation, because you can't stay indefinitely in this room, Madam Speaker, and I don't want to see you die. And even if we don't think it has corners, we think it's circular. So you're getting to curl up to die. We haven't really disagreed with anything that we said about what it means to be human, Madam Speaker. We think that what it means to be human is to explore, and they kind of poo-pooed this idea of like, well, exploration, maybe that's all right for Queen Isabella. First of all, Queen Isabella was red. But secondly, Madam Speaker, we think that's why we climbed Mount Everest, because it was there. We wouldn't be in North America if people stayed put. Nothing would happen if people let fear limit their action to such a degree that we never learned anything. They said, Brent gets up and talks about this idea of the double effect being horseshit, but then doesn't tell us why it's horseshit. I think Stephen gave you excellent analysis as when you're presented with the only viable option of saving yourself or committing and extending yourself as a human with being this kind of symbol, this kind of action, that it's not your moral duty to not do it. In fact, it's the moral duty of the creator, whoever put it there, to respect the fact that an action happened. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put you in there. You've heard this idea that this person is necessarily evil. We don't think that they're necessarily evil. We don't think you learn more just by staying silent, Mr. Speaker. We think that the individual and what makes a human human is the capacity to extrapolate, which I never disagreed with. After 34 minutes, if you can extrapolate, then maybe you should press that button. We think you should, Madam Speaker. For all these reasons, we propose.